They didn't know what they were getting into. All they saw in their eyes was gold.
A lot of folks thought that getting to the Yukon was a simple thing. You just scoop up the gold with your bare hands, but the reality was, of course, far, far different.
Like stampeding buffalo, these stampeders have overcome more adversity than any of them could have ever foreseen.
Dawson City is 500 miles away. And along that trail, the snow is sometimes 20 feet deep. Winds howling 50 miles an hour. Temperatures down to 70 below.
They've dealt with gangsters trying to swindle them out of everything they had. They've triumphed over some of Alaska's highest mountains, defeating the ghastly shadows that awaited their every turn.
Most of those folks weren't miners or outdoors folks at all, and then there they were, thrust in the middle of nowhere, having to fend for themselves.
They manufactured floating vessels with their bare hands, which would transport them to the gold fields.
I've never built a boat with my bare hands out of green logs I had to saw myself. That sounds pretty amazing.
They went up here not knowing what obstacles they were going to face, and that cost them dearly.
After all of that, they stared the devil in the eyes while pushing through the monstrous Whitehorse Rapids.
The Yukon River is actually a very shallow river. Very fast current. We're talking about 7 knots an hour in the springtime especially.
The lure of gold had consumed their very souls, and nothing short of the Grim Reaper himself was going to stand in their way.
People were desperate, and gold was like the shining light. You know, people dropped everything to come here, and very few of them made it.
Now, for the stampeders that survived, there was only one more hurdle between them and their subarctic El Dorado. After the distressing surprise of the Whitehorse Rapids, the men and women on the trail to the Klondike were no longer going to assume the worst was behind them. A wise decision as they approached the final obstacle only 200 miles outside of Dawson.
The Five Finger Rapids are further up the Yukon River, and it was the last piece of really treacherous water between here and Dawson.
Much like the rapids near Whitehorse, the Five Finger Rapids greeted the stampeders with a vengeance.
It's 4 big rocks right in the middle of the river, and the channels are quite narrow, and of course more rivers join in with the Yukon and make the current run harder and harder, so by the time they get there, it's really moving quite along.
There were 5 different ways to pass through the jagged rocks, only one of which was even remotely safe.
Apparently the right side is the good one. I'll bet they didn't know on the first try, though.
The entire quest from Seattle to this point on the Yukon River separated the men from the boys. Only the valiant remained, and while still on high alert, it was smooth sailing from this point on.
But after that, it's actually not so bad. They say that was the most pleasant part of the trip.
Every man, woman, and child sailing to the Klondike had different expectations for when they arrived.
They had been through a real arduous trip. And, you know, it wasn't just the Chilkoot Trail. They were going through Whitehorse Rapids, Five Finger Rapids, again, contending with the river conditions and whatnot and the cold.
Many were probably expecting to see a glow from the abundance of gold as the confluence of the Klondike River to the Yukon River began to creep over the horizon.
There were rumors at the very beginning that the creek beds were basically just lined with gold, and it was just like a carpet of gold in the creek beds.
Many of them thought that they could just scoop the gold nuggets directly off the ground. And there were even some things written up about, you know, you could pick them off of bushes. Silly, of course.
What they did in fact see was an emerging town.
Well, when people arrived in Dawson, certainly reality hit them in the face.
As they pulled their boats to shore, they were greeted by hundreds of people who had already staked claim in their promised land.
Arriving here, if there was one thing they were going to find out that first day was, hey, all of those best claims, they were staked a long time ago.
You know, if they weren't early, a lot of the good claims were taken.
How could this be? How, after shedding blood, sweat, and tears, could the leading stampeders be too late?
The reality is that the vast majority of these stampeders, when they got to the Klondike gold fields and to Dawson City, they discovered that the majority of the good claims had already been staked by those prospectors who are already in Alaska and the Yukon.
Remember, Their journey didn't begin until July 1897, which was 11 months after the discovery of gold in the Klondike. On August 16, 1896, an American prospector by the name of George Carmack, his wife Kate Carmack, her brother Skookum Jim, and their nephew Dawson Charlie discovered huge quantities of gold on one of the Klondike's tributaries.
This discovery of gold took place along a little tiny creek, which was called Rabbit Creek, which isn't a very glorious name. So they very quickly decided to change the name to Bonanza Creek, which seemed to be more fitting.
And the story goes that after dinner one day, Skookum Jim was down at the creek's edge and he saw what appeared to be pieces of cheese in the creek. Well, it wasn't cheese, it was gold.
The claims were registered the very next day, and the news of this discovery spread like wildfire to the mining camps in the Yukon River Valley.
They went to the tavern and said, well, guess what we found? And they say the next day in the town of 40 Mile, you couldn't find a boat because everyone who had been in the bar that night, including some of the Mounties, had headed upstream to the Klondike to stake their claims.
All of the claims around them were picked up very quickly.
And it was pretty much the prospectors of the town of 40 Mile who got the good claims in the Klondike region.
By the end of August, all of Bonanza Creek had been claimed by miners.
And nearby was an even richer creek, which they would call El Dorado. And these were two of the richest creeks in the world.
By mid-December 1896, word of the riches in Dawson had reached the nearest large settlement in Alaska, Circle City. The Yukon River was frozen at the time, but the prospectors in Circle City were able to reach the gold fields in Dawson by dog sled before all the best claims were taken. It wouldn't be for another 7 months that the story of the discovery reached the outside world with the arrivals of the steamships Excelsior and Portland to the docks of the western continental United States. By the time the first wave of stampeders arrived in Dawson, nearly 2 years had passed since the Klondike gold discovery. Disappointment couldn't even begin to describe the undying sadness felt in their hearts and minds as they saw their golden rug pulled from under them. By the spring of 1898, the town of Dawson grew from 500 to more than 30,000.
There is a saying that 1 million people dreamt of coming up here. 100,000 actually laid plans. 30 to 40,000 would actually arrive here, but only a few hundred would strike it rich.
Hundreds were filled with such bitterness and resentment toward their shattered dreams that they immediately began their journey home.
And many of them would actually set up along the riverbank here, above their rafts or boats or scows, a for sale sign.
They sold what was left of their equipment, their pickaxes and so on, just enough to get out of the Yukon, go down the river, get to St. Michael at the mouth, grab a steamer back to Seattle or wherever they came from.
But there were others that were more entrepreneurial, and they realized that, you know, these miners, they might need entertainment, they might need baked goods, they might need their laundry or sewing done. Why not stay here and mine the miners?
For tens of thousands, Dawson City was their new home.
They were pretty disappointed, but there were definitely a lot of other ways to make money during the gold rush.
Those that got there and couldn't get a claim worked on other people's claims.
Some of these people, by doing that, would be able to kind of keep their ear to the possible sale of a mine if it came available, and they were able to buy that claim and do fairly well.
Make no mistake, despite the stampeders being too late to stake their own claims, gold was still very prevalent throughout the city. It was now time to get creative for a big piece of the pie. It wasn't long before the feeling of disappointment turned into a feeling of determination. The booming Dawson City was nothing these brave men and women haven't seen before. They've defeated Seattle, Skagway, Bennett, Canyon City, and although the game has changed, they were now ready to take on the final chapter, the Klondike.